forth. Madam Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and pass without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed?
Agreed.
All in favour say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried. Orders of the day. Oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is 12:40. We'll proceed to 1:41. Thank you. 12:41. I now recognize the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is time the NDP government and this Premier started working for Nova Scotians. The current power structure in Nova Scotia, Madam Speaker, benefits Nova Scotia Power and its executives, not the people of this province. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier stand up to Nova Scotia Power and demand a reduction in the return on equity?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, when this government came to power, one of the first things it did was to take the HST off of home electricity. There is not 1 cent of provincial tax on electricity in this province because of what this caucus has done with respect to the cost of power in the province, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, we inherited the system put in place by past Conservative and Liberal governments.
The Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Madam Speaker, there is a tax on power bills in this province called the NDP electricity tax, and it was imposed, Madam Speaker, by this government shortly after coming into power, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, more than $100 million a year is being taken out of Nova Scotians by Nova Scotia Power and delivered to Emera to invest elsewhere. Last year was a record-breaking year with the profits of $123.5 million. A 9.2% return on equity is simply too much for a company that faces no risk. My question to the Premier, will the Premier break Nova Scotia Power's monopoly and make the power company to compete in a highly regulated market to ensure the rate of return is fair to all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's what they say, but that's not what they mean. What they mean is they want to get on the road to deregulation, Mr. Speaker. They want to drive up power costs. The energy critic for the Liberal Party tabled in this House legislation that would lead to the deregulation of the utility, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, rather. And I would like to read for the Leader of the Opposition the New Brunswick Energy Blueprint in October of 2011 that responded to their own legislation. And it says, in particular, competitive markets have not developed in New Brunswick as anticipated, and given what has occurred in British Columbia, Ontario and elsewhere where competitive electricity markets have also failed to thrive, there is little likelihood that it will happen, Mr. Speaker, and I will table that to the Leader of the Opposition.
The Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Madam Speaker, here's one guarantee that if the Premier continues to sit idly by without any solutions, the power rates are going to continue to rise in this province, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, and the people of this province don't need to worry about when we say something on this side of the House, we mean it. When that Premier says something, Madam Speaker, he means something completely different. For example, he opposed the efficiency tax before the election, but once Nova Scotians voted, he changed his mind pretty quickly, Madam Speaker, and added a tax to every power bill in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, the Premier doesn't mind asking classroom teachers to do more with less. He doesn't mind asking nurses and healthcare workers to do more with less. Why is he afraid to stand up and tell Nova Scotia Power executives to do more with less?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as the Leader of the Opposition knows, we said last year that we would not allow executive bonuses to go into power rates, that they were going to be paid by the shareholder. That's what's happened. That's what's happening again in this rate filing, Madam Speaker. And perhaps the next time the Leader of the Opposition stands up, he can tell Nova Scotians whether or not, if they, God forbid, wherever the government, whether they would in fact put back in place the HST on home electricity.
Now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, just last month, the threat of a work stoppage at Capital Health led to the cancellation of over 500 surgeries and 2,000 important health procedures for residents not just of the capital area but for all Nova Scotia. Now, less than a month later, we know that there is an upcoming collective bargaining session between Nova Scotia's 6,500 nurses and all of the capital health districts of the province. Today, the president of the Nova Scotia Nurses Union, when asked if that could lead to a strike, said yes, that's exactly what it would mean, and I table that for the benefit of the Premier and the House. Madam Speaker, it is not acceptable to the patients of Nova Scotia that they be the ones to have their important surgeries set aside, their important health care procedures set aside because of an impasse in collective bargaining. My question to the Premier, what plan does the Premier have to ensure that these important health services are protected and that our health system is not yet again held up in turmoil because of the threat of a work stoppage?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, the nurses in our province are among a group of excellent healthcare workers that we have throughout the province. They provide great frontline care. They are literally the face of our healthcare system. We intend to bargain with them fairly. We hope to reach a reasonable resolve with them on this round of bargaining. That is a commitment that we make on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Of course the nurses are a very important part of our healthcare system. That is exactly the point. They are crucial to the delivery of healthcare services to all Nova Scotians. Nurses are people who chose to go into the healthcare system because they care about the ongoing delivery of important services and surgeries and procedures to all Nova Scotians. That's why the province needs to know that those services will be protected and maintained as collective bargaining sessions go on, and even in the event of an impasse. But the Premier refuses to stand up for those Nova Scotians, just like he refused to stand up for them last time when he stood by and watched 500 surgeries cancelled and 2,000 other important healthcare procedures cancelled, Madam Speaker, because of the threat of a disruption to healthcare services. So my question to the Premier right now, will he commit to bringing a plan into this House before it adjourns for the summer to show Nova Scotians that he will make sure their healthcare services go on uninterrupted?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we plan on fulfilling our responsibility with respect to collective bargaining in the province to treat nurses fairly. What we're not going to do is what is suggested by the Leader of the Conservative Party, where he would bring in legislation to affect collective bargaining rights, the same kind of legislation, Madam Speaker, that led to 4 illegal strikes in Alberta, Mr. Speaker. The same kind of legislation is what he would like to see in here.
Recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Madam Speaker, the fact that the Premier wants to debate our plan is exactly the point. He has no plan of his own. And as we learn in this question period, he refuses to bring in a plan before the House rises for the summer. He's okay with leaving all Nova Scotians exposed to the risk that they will lose their surgeries, they will lose their important health care procedures, because he won't bring a plan into this House before it breaks for the summer. But you know what, Madam Speaker? There is a bill on the order paper that deals with this right now, that preserves collective bargaining, that respects taxpayers, and also keeps those services going. So will the Premier commit to calling that bill for debate before the House rises? Yes or no?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, the legislation that the Leader of the Conservative Party is talking about is the exact legislation that led to illegal strikes in Alberta. Madam Speaker, one of the longest strikes in healthcare in this country took place in Alberta by nurses who already have legislation that outlaws strikes. We have seen this time and again. Perhaps the Leader of the Conservative Party did not learn from Bill 68 when nurses simply resigned. Can you imagine what kind of chaos they would create in the healthcare system?
Recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Madam Speaker, another year of NDP governance and another rate increase is on the way. In fact, there are at least 3 more rate increases. The hearings for proposed rate increase will begin on September 13, 2012. My question for the Premier, Does the Premier oppose the intended rate increases for 2013, 2014, and 2015 by Nova Scotia Power?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I oppose is a system that was left to us by the Liberals and Conservatives and former administrations, Mr. Speaker. That is why we are Madam Speaker, I'm sorry I keep doing that. That is why we are changing the system. That's why we brought forward an electricity plan that shifts us off of coal, that ensures that we will move to renewables that are the most stable form of a rate base in the country. We're fixing a mess they left behind, and they won't even say if they would reimpose the HST on electricity. When will they tell us?
The Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Madam Speaker, I was honoured and privileged to be able to represent my party and my constituents at the last rate increase and ask and question Nova Scotia Power executives about the direction of their company and why they were continuing asking Nova Scotians to pay more money while their executive compensation package was going up. My question to the Premier, will he show leadership and clear his schedule and show up at the rate hearing increase in September and oppose any rate increase by Nova Scotia Power?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, the government will, of course, be represented there. What I think we need to understand is that as a government, we're the ones who took the HST off of home electricity, and yet the Leader of the Opposition now has had the opportunity. He's been on his feet since I last spoke, but he refuses to say that he would not keep that in place, Mr. Speaker. That's because they wouldn't retract the HST because they would have done the same thing. They would have put the HST in place. They put it in place in the first instance, and now, Mr. Speaker, we see that when they voted against it in this House, when they campaigned against it, of course, Mr. Speaker, they're in favour of higher taxes on electricity.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Madam Speaker, when I tell Nova Scotians something, they can believe it, unlike the Premier. Madam Speaker, this is the Premier that went around Nova Scotia and told Nova Scotians that he was going to take the HST off of electricity, Madam Speaker. But, Madam Speaker, he forgot to tell them that he was going to impose an NDP electricity tax on every power bill across this province, Madam Speaker. And under the Premier's watch, Madam Speaker, under the Premier's watch, our electricity rates have increased by over 20%, and no stoppage in sight, Madam Speaker. They're continuing to decline. Under the Premier's watch, Madam Speaker, we've seen executive salaries at Nova Scotia Power go through the roof as high as our rates are climbing, with not a whisper out of the Premier, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, my question for the Premier, will he show leadership, show up at the rate hearing, defend Nova Scotians, and demand no rate increases on power bills?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, instead of just defending ratepayers in Nova Scotia when it's convenient, I do it every single day, Mr. Speaker. That is why we took the HST off of home electricity, Mr. Speaker. That is why we have brought in an electricity plan that actually means that rates will become stable over the long term. That's why we signed a memorandum of agreement on the Lower Churchill with Newfoundland and Labrador. And we have a Leader of the Opposition who won't even say whether or not he would put the HST back on home electricity. Really, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first question. Thank
you, Madam Speaker. The energy efficiency tax the NDP government added to power bills across the province of Nova Scotia has taken $40 million out of the pockets of Nova Scotians. My question to the Premier, why does the Premier believe that Nova Scotians ratepayers should pay that and not Nova Scotia Power shareholders?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, I will table on I will table right now the testimony before the Public Accounts Committee of Mr. Crandall-Meyer from Efficiency Nova Scotia that points out that $100 million in benefits have been returned to Nova Scotians through energy efficiency efforts, Madam Speaker. That is because we are committed to ensuring that conservation has a place in Nova Scotia. We know, and the Leader of the Opposition should know, that conservation efforts actually lead to benefits for ratepayers, not costs.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Madam Speaker, just imagine if shareholders were paying for that, there would be $140 million benefits. And I want to remind the Premier that not only is it a benefit to ratepayers, it's a real benefit to shareholders of Nova Scotia Power, Madam Speaker, when they do not have to invest in more power production. It is the power company that should be paying the NDP electricity tax. Madam Speaker, in the 2009 election, the Premier and the NDP opposed this tax. Madam Speaker, and I want to table a letter that they had sent to URB saying just that. But, Madam Speaker, that was before Nova Scotians voted. Following the vote, all of a sudden, the Premier fell in love with the NDP electricity tax, and he added it to every power bill across the province. So why does the Premier think that Nova Scotia ratepayers should pay the NDP electricity tax and not the shareholders?
The Honourable Premier.
As you know, Madam Speaker, the conservation efforts mean that ratepayers get a tangible benefit. In fact, 2.5 times the cost that they pay to Efficiency Nova Scotia. This was a program that came forward through the Utility and Review Board. It turns out that it has been very, very beneficial to ratepayers. So what I guess I would like to know from the Leader of the Opposition is, in addition to putting the HST back onto electricity, would he also do away with Efficiency Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Madam Speaker, we're trying to find those Nova Scotians who say this $100 million the Premier's talking about, because every Nova Scotian is talking to this caucus and is talking to every other Nova Scotian is talking about their power rates increasing, not decreasing. Madam Speaker, that has happened under his leadership. That has happened under the leadership of Premier Dexter and the NDP government in Nova Scotia, Madam Speaker. He said 3 years. He said 3 years to respond to the people of Nova Scotia, and the only thing he's done around electricity is added the NDP electricity tax, another $40 million taken in the pockets of Nova Scotia, and he's allowed the Nova Scotia Power executives to do as they wish, to take more and more money out of the pockets of Nova Scotians, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, no one is opposed to energy efficiency. No one is opposed to energy efficiency. The question is who pays. They believe ratepayers should pay. We believe Nova Scotia Power shareholders should pay. Will the Premier show up at the Utility Review Board and demand that the shareholders pay for his NDP electricity tax?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, one of the first things we did when we came into this House is we fought for lower prices for consumers by taking the HST off of electricity. Something that the members of that party campaigned against, something they voted against here, and if they had their way, Mr. Speaker, they would tax electricity and send it even higher.
Now recognize the Honourable Member for Argyll on his first
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Yesterday, we learned that only after Nova Scotia Power asked to raise rates by 6% over the next 2 years, their parent company, Emera, threw a party at Salty's restaurant on the Halifax waterfront. The party had a guest list of only 28 people, yet featured 3 different entertainment acts. It seems no expenses were barred. What a slap in the face of Nova Scotia ratepayers. At a time when Nova Scotians can't even afford to get a meal at Salty's because of the NDP's economic mismanagement, Emera executives are partying it up only a day after asking ratepayers to cough up even more. My question, Mr. Speaker, through you, is to the Premier. When will the Premier stand up for ratepayers and tell Emera enough is enough and ask their executives to issue an apology to Nova Scotians for an offensive gesture?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, well, I will say this. I think if what the honourable member sets out is true, I think it was extraordinarily ill-advised and, quite frankly, shows poor judgment. The reality is, though, Mr. Speaker, we have been left with a MERA, with a structure, with Nova Scotia Power, something that was created as a result of both of the parties who sat across us. They privatized it. Surely they must have known when they were privatizing it that this day would have come.
The honourable member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Madam Speaker, let's talk about some of these things that the Premier is bringing up. In fact, we don't know anything about what the Premier agrees to do for Nova Scotia Power Emera. Apparently, that they didn't even take notes at the Premier's office. The Premier has failed to produce a single shred of documentation regarding his dealings with Emera and NSP. No correspondence, no minutes from meetings, nothing. Initially, we thought it was odd that the Premier of Nova Scotia would have no records of dealings with Nova Scotia Power or for his parent company. But we do know the truth at this point, Madam Speaker. A FOIPOP obtained by our office shows the Premier and members of his staff flew between Halifax and St. John's on November 17th and 18th to announce the $6.2 billion Churchill mega project. But just how did they get there, Madam Speaker? They took the Emera corporate jet. But while the Premier was busy joining the Mile High Club with Nova Scotia Power, ratepayers were the ones getting taken for a ride. My question, Mr. Speaker, when will the Premier stop cozying up to Emera executives and getting pulled into their agenda and putting ratepayers first for a change?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, just so we're absolutely clear and so that the leader, I know that the member for Argyll doesn't really care about facts, but the fact of the matter is that we paid the commercial rate for the flight. It is, in fact, the most convenient way to get there on that particular day because we were making an announcement that is going to change the energy landscape of our region. This was the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador for the Lower Churchill project. Mr. Speaker, if you're asking me, or Madam Speaker, if you're asking me, I think that was a great day for Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And don't worry, the Premier did ensure taxpayers were reimbursed. They reimbursed Emera to the tune of $2,045.82. After all, don't forget, times are tough at Emera, that you got to pay them back so quickly. The fact that the Premier won't discuss a single thing. Times are tough at Emera. Times are tough at Emera. Times are tough. The fact that the Premier won't disclose a single thing, not a single thing, the fact that the Premier won't disclose a single thing about what his minister calls his intimate knowledge of Emera, but then enjoys a mile-high adventure on their corporate jet, seriously raises ethical questions that need to be answered, Madam Speaker. The Premier just can't hide from this one any longer. Why won't the Premier tell us what was discussed on the corporate jet ride? Why does his office have no record or anything discussed with Emera or Nova Scotia Power at any time? What is he hiding?
The Honourable Premier.
You got to hand it to them, Madam Speaker. So if I wouldn't have paid for it, I would have received some kind of a benefit. If I do pay for it, I'm guilty of somehow repaying it too quickly. Madam Speaker, I can tell you this. This was a great day for Nova Scotia. The Lower Churchill Memorandum of Understanding was signed on that day. That was the way to get there and get back in order to be able to do business on behalf of the province. And I realize that the former cabinet minister, the member for Argyll, has no idea about the necessity to do business on behalf of Nova Scotians, and that's why they had the worst economic record in decades, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we just learned that on top of the highest power rates in Canada, double-digit executive pay increases and private jets, Emera just threw a lavish party for 28 of its executives. The party included comedians, a private concert, food and drinks, all of which were paid for by the company, the same company that makes its profits from Nova Scotia Power ratepayers. Madam Speaker, the company is refusing to reveal the true costs of the party. So in light of the request for another 6% rate increase from Nova Scotia Power, will the Premier demand that Emera and Nova Scotia Power disclose the true costs of their lavish party?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, as the member would know, Emera is a private concern. He would know that because, of course, it was his government when he was a cabinet minister that put in place the structure that created Emera.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Madam Speaker, the member for Lunenburg West and Pictou East might not think this is a serious question, but they might want to check with their constituents as to whether they believe having their money going to pay for lavish parties is a serious question or not. Madam Speaker, this is clearly a culture of waste in Emera and Nova Scotia Power. On May 10th of this year, the Liberal leader asked the Premier to demand a value-for-money audit of Nova Scotia Power that would eliminate and expose such wasteful behaviour. The audit, different from other audits performed recently, would be paid for by shareholders, not ratepayers, and the Premier refused. The NDP believes that audits are too expensive, even though the power monopoly would be prevented from passing costs on to ratepayers. So my question to the Premier is, why is the Premier protecting Nova Scotia Power shareholders for paying for an audit and defending the monopoly's wasteful behaviour?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, of course, as you would know, the procedure before the Utility and Review Board is one that is overseen by, in fact, the Utility and Review Board. But I will table, just so the member opposite recalls, because I'm sure he recalls, that his energy critic actually went very specifically to the Utility and the Review Board at the time. They detailed the same explanation they have put forward today and in the past, and the Utility and Review Board said there are numerous audits that take place of Nova Scotia Power, that they've looked at it in detail, that the cost of these audits do in fact get passed on to the ratepayers, and that it was an unwise thing to do.
Recognize the Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, Madam Speaker, maybe the Premier can explain to Nova Scotians the recent excessive increases to executives, to lavish parties, as to whether those audits prevented those from taking place and how that may have protected Nova Scotia ratepayers. So, Speaker, government's backbenchers also lined up to beg that shareholders not have to pay for an audit in the defence of Nova Scotia Power. The member for Lunenburg said that the idea, quote, of having audits that will cost far too much is just something that we don't want to consider, end quote. And the member for Halifax, Citadel, Sable Island said, quote, that Nova Scotia Power Incorporated has gone through a number of audits, very expensive audits, end quote. Madam Speaker, it's clear that the audits to which Nova Scotia Power has been subjected to date are clearly not putting an end to these excessive increases and lavish parties. So my question to the Premier is, why is this government more concerned about protecting Nova Scotia Power shareholders and defending the Power Corporation's wasteful behaviour than defending Nova Scotia ratepayers?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it's this caucus that is speaking up on behalf of ratepayers. We're the one that take the HST off of home electricity, Mr. Speaker. It is us that are making sure that the kinds of things that are being suggested, like additional audits, and I won't say just an audit because it's additional audits. Audits have been done over and over and over again to look at the operations of Nova Scotia Power, and the board, and I've already tabled this, says very specifically the cost of such reviews ordered by the board must ultimately be recovered from the taxpayers. Accordingly, the board is very conscious that it should only order such reviews or audits when absolutely necessary for the protection of the taxpayer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Our office in a Freedom of Information request, and I'll table that here today, asked for all correspondence between the Premier's office in Emera and the Premier's office in Nova Scotia Power for almost 3 years. Surprisingly, only 3 emails were found. The Minister of Energy said the Premier was intimately involved, Madam Speaker, with the Muskrat Falls project, and his mile-high jaunt proves that. Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, my question to the Premier is, why is there no written record of communications between his office and Emera about the Muskrat Falls project or affordable power rates for the next the entire 3 years?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, it's because I work with the Department of Energy. I get my advice through my officials. I look for the materials that they produce. I look at their analysis. I realize that that's a concept that is absolutely foreign to the member opposite, because obviously they didn't do it when they were in government.
The honourable member for Argyle on his first supplementary.
Madam Speaker, if all that was going on, then the FOIPOP would have generated more than 3 emails. There's a growing cloud of secrecy around the Premier's intimate involvement with Mera and Nova Scotia Power, traveling on the corporate jet, signing on to projects without asking the cost, and giving himself the ability to set the scope of the project review. Madam Speaker, my question to the Premier is, why is there not one single piece of correspondence from the Premier to Emera or Nova Scotia Power fighting for more affordable power rates for Nova Scotia ratepayers?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, apparently there is such a cloud of secrecy that I stood on a stage in front of 1,000 people in Newfoundland and Labrador to announce the signing of the MOU with then Premier Williams. It is apparently such a cloud of secrecy that I brought the now Premier of Newfoundland, Premier Dunderdale, to the Red Room here to have her speak to talk about the importance of the Lower Churchill project. Madam Speaker, this is about a government that actually has some vision for the long-term energy health of our region and of this province and the protection of our ratepayers.
The honourable member for Argyle on his final supplementary.
The only vision from this government is putting the blinders on when it comes to energy rates in this province, and that is an absolute shame. The intimate relationship seems to be one of Emera pulling the wool over the eyes of the naive NDP. Muskrat Falls may be the best renewable energy project for Nova Scotia, but it's been a year and a half since the Premier took Emera's jet to sign the term sheet, and there continues to be more questions than answers. Madam Speaker, my question to the Premier is to clear the cloud of secrecy around the project. Will the Premier publicly demand to know the cost of the Muskrat Falls project to be borne by Nova Scotia ratepayers before any more time is wasted, where we could be looking at other green energy options?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, when this project was announced, the leader of the Conservative Party endorsed it. He did so in front of the National, I believe, in front of the National Press Club. He talked about it as a great electricity project and a great economic development project, Mr. Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, the reality is the agreement between the Lower Churchill, between Nalcor and Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia Power, Emera, is a subject of an agreement. That agreement has not yet been signed. Until it is, Madam Speaker, of course, the cost cannot be ascertained, but once that agreement is signed, it will go to the Utility Review Board so that there is complete transparency.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Madam Speaker, as of this morning, there were over 21,000 Nova Scotians who have signed on to a petition which would call on the NDP government to direct the Utility Review Board to deny Nova Scotia Power any general rate increases for the next 3 years. As I stand here now, 22,321 Nova Scotians have signed a petition calling on the Premier to show leadership on power rates. So my question is, will the Premier listen to the 22,321 Nova Scotians who have already signed on to the petition and direct that the Utility and Review Board deny any further rate increases for Nova Scotia Power for the next 3 years?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, I don't know exactly what the number was. I thought he said 22,300 Nova Scotians had signed it. Those are 22,300 people who had the HST removed from their power bills.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Madam Speaker, the issue here is simple. People across the province are finding it increasingly difficult to keep up with the increasing power rates. In the past decade, power rates have gone up 40%. That's 7 times that Nova Scotia Power has turned to Nova Scotians for more money, all the while reporting record profits. In less than a week, over 22,000 Nova Scotians have declared that they've had enough. This government is the only entity that has the power to take action and stand up to Nova Scotia Power. So my question to the Premier is, why won't this NDP government take action on behalf of Nova Scotians, stand up to Nova Scotia Power and say no to further rate increases?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, those 22,300 people had the HST taken off by this government, and we will make sure that crowd over there never gets a chance to put it back on.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, Madam Speaker, we're talking numbers. We can say that all Nova Scotia ratepayers are paying more because of the NDP electricity tax that this government brought in. You know, Madam Speaker, we heard the Premier say last week that in light of the high bonuses paid to Nova Scotia Power executives, that in fact he commended Nova Scotia Power for reducing its executives. Well, after what we heard today, it's quite clear that they've reduced in their communications department when they have the Premier as their chief apologist here in Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, the NDP is the same party that when they were sitting on this side of the House would have been standing up for Nova Scotians and demanding that government take action to bring power rates in line with what Nova Scotians could afford. Now we're being told, wait for the future where you're going to have still high power rates, but they'll be more stable. Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians are looking for leadership, and they're looking for it now. Instead, Madam Speaker, this government decides to stand up for Nova Scotia Power for 23% executive salary increases, millionaires while Nova Scotians can't pay their power bills, private jets, and now lavish parties. At the same time, they're asking for more for Nova Scotians. So my question again, why will the Premier not stand up to Nova Scotians and tell the UARB that there will be no further rate increases from Nova Scotia Power for the next 3 years?
The Honourable Premier.
You know, it would be amusing if it wasn't so sad. We've watched them stand up and ask question after question after question about electricity rates, but they still will not answer the question of whether or not they would put the HST back on home electricity. They campaigned against us taking it off. They voted against it, Mr. Speaker. What people in this province need to know is that the Liberals are committed to higher electricity rates, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, this government inherited the system that they left behind.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we know that this year 50 collective agreements will be bargained at the IWK and the District Health Authorities. We already saw last month what disruption the threat of a strike can have on patient care. We know it doesn't have to be that way. There is a way to end the unethical practice of locking out the patients when the bargaining gets tough. With 50 agreements up this year, this urgent matter should be addressed before this House adjourns. So, Madam Speaker, my question through you to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, why is the NDP rushing out of the House before presenting a plan that would eliminate healthcare interruptions that could see 100 more surgeries cancelled and cause unnecessary fear and anxiety for patients?
The Honourable the Premier.
Where's Rodney? Where's Waldo?
Can I ask again who the question is to? Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm proud to say that when this government calls a session into order, we introduce good legislation and we take our time and make sure that it gets through this House in an orderly way and that it serves the citizens of this province. I'm really pleased that over 90% of collective agreement arrangements end in a settlement. And that is a track record that we're very proud of. We do everything we can to ensure that the number is even higher. But the right to collective bargaining is one guaranteed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and certainly we respect that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, NDP partisan Linda Power has been appointed to the board responsible for determining the raises going to NSGEU Local 42 members, and NDP partisan Ray Larkin will represent the union. The deck is stacked with NDP members who will be more interested in keeping a tight relationship with Big Labour than protecting the rights of patients. They've stacked both sides of the table with card-carrying members and are clearly more interested in pursuing their Labour agenda than protecting the rights of patients. So, Madam Speaker, my question to you, to the Minister, why will the Minister not commit to getting ahead of this very evident problem and put forward solutions to be debated in this House before the end of this session?
Recognize the Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to remind everyone in this House that the Department of Labour and Advanced Education manages the process used, and I don't think it's any surprise to anyone that when you have an arbitration panel, that each side has the right to choose an arbitrator, and then they decide on someone that is neutral and that they agree serves as chair. The collective bargaining process works well across this country. We respect that process. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on his final supplementary.
Madam Speaker, the effect of healthcare labour disruptions are not just theory. They have a devastating effects on real Nova Scotians. Imagine the anguish that Lisa Morehouse felt when she learned her cancer procedures were put in jeopardy because of the threat of strike of the NSGEU Local 42. So my question through you to the Minister, will the Minister make sure that no other Nova Scotians have to suffer like Lisa Morehouse did? With Bill 102, she showed us how fond she is of changing labour legislation. Right. Will she commit to putting forward legislation before the end of this session to immediately deal with the looming labour disruptions in our healthcare system?
There you go. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Certainly, there's nothing more I can say except that we appreciate and honour the due process involved with the collective bargaining process. We respect the rights of workers to be involved in that process. And certainly, I have to say that having reasonable people wanting to come to a settlement, sitting around the table, is the place to settle this and not to be yelling at one another across the floor of this House. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Clayton Park.
Madam Speaker, power rates have gone up 7 times in the last 11 years, and people are paying now 40% more for power than they did 10 years ago, and they're being forced now to choose between buying groceries and paying that power bill. In fact, power rates have gone up close to 20% under the NDP government. Every member of the Liberal caucus has signed the petition calling on the government to direct the UARB to deny rate increases to Nova Scotia Power. The creator of the petition contacted the Premier on May 14th to ask the Premier to listen to the now more than 22,000 Nova Scotians who signed the petition and to stop Nova Scotia Power from increasing rates yet again. My question, Madam Speaker, is for the Premier. How has the Premier's office responded to this call for action?
The Honourable Premier.
One of the things that we did, even before the petition, we didn't have to wait for a petition to understand the problems that were left behind by the Conservatives and Liberals when they privatized the system. We didn't have to wait for that. We knew that there was a problem. That's why we brought out the electricity plan. That's why we're getting off of fossil fuels. That's why we're not waiting for the coal regulations that are going to come down from the federal Conservatives and would drive sky high the cost of electricity in this province. We didn't wait for the opposition parties. We took the HST off of home electricity. This is a government that cares about the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this NDP government is the very government who added a tax to the power bills of every Nova Scotian, and that was a tax that they had promised not to do. To make it even worse, Madam Speaker, it was a tax they had promised not to add. That's worse. Madam Madam Speaker, if 22,000 Nova Scotians came to the legislature, the Premier would be forced to listen. And if those same 22,000 people called the Premier's office, they would, he will be forced to listen. However, because it's an electronic petition, the concerns seem to be dismissed by the Premier of this NDP government.
Please. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As I was saying, more than 22,000 people have signed the petition. If they came here in person or if they phoned the office of the Premier, he would be forced to listen. And because the petition is electronic, I believe it's just as meaningful, just as important. In the past, while in opposition, the NDP championed causes and brought petitions to this House. Now that they are in government, the NDP is turning a blind eye. My question to the Premier, Madam Speaker, will the Premier listen to these thousands of Nova Scotians and finally stand up to Nova Scotia Power and direct the UARB to deny the continued rate increases?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, we brought a petition to the House for the purposes of taking the HST off of home electricity. We did that. I'd like to know why the member for Clayton Park insists on voting against lower energy prices, wants to put the tax back on electricity.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Madam Speaker, energy prices have done nothing but rise and rise, 20% now under the 3 years of this NDP government. So the people of Nova Scotia know, and that's why they're up in arms, Madam Speaker. That's why they're signing this petition, and that's why they are asking the government to pay attention now, not for what they did in the past. What are they doing now to help with those prices? Madam Speaker, this problem is not going to go away. The government would like to hunker down and finish up with the legislature and hope that this problem will go away. Well, it won't, because the people are now on fire. They're interested, they're following this, and they are not going away. Madam Speaker, will the Premier commit to all Nova Scotians that he will finally wake up and protect ratepayers from another increase?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, we have the system that we have in place today because of decisions that was made by the members opposite when they were in government. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, they decided to chain us to fossil fuel prices, and I can tell you this, Madam Speaker, if they had their way, price of electricity in this province would be 8% higher today.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Through question period today, we've heard the Premier play the blame game, blaming members of this side of the House for all the ills, but I might remind the Premier that he's in charge now. It's his responsibility to look out for the ratepayers of Nova Scotia, the people of Nova Scotia, and not Nova Scotia Power executives and shareholders. Madam Speaker, last week Nova Scotia Power announced their intention to hike power rates by another 6% over the next 2 years. The very next day, Madam Speaker, we learned that executives at NSP saw double-digit pay increases, including the CEO, who got a 23%, yes, Madam Speaker, a 23% pay increase. Wow. My question to the Premier, will the Premier tell Nova Scotians why they should hand over more of their hard-earned income to Nova Scotia Power while their CEO gets a 23% increase?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, I'll say one thing for the member for Cape Breton South. He's right about this. I am in charge now, and we are making sure that we are cleaning up the mess that you guys left behind.
For Cape Breton South on his first supplementary.
I'm not going to pay too much attention to the bragging of the Premier that he's now in charge, but Madam Speaker, after the next election, there are a number of issues that are going to take that government down over there, and one of those issues is power rates in Nova Scotia, unless they do something about it, I'll tell you that. The NDP are good at saying one thing before an election and another after. And I can remember when they were on this side of the House railing away at Nova Scotia Power, railing away at power increases, talking about skyrocketing costs, saying, how can we trust you now, like the Minister of Health used to love saying when she was on this side of the House. You know, so Nova Scotians still remember when you guys were over here and what you said then and what you're saying now.
Order, please.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia.
Order, please. Order. Just want to remind all members that their comments should be reflected through the Speaker, and the use of "you" is not permitted. I recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton South on his.
Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians are telling us that the pay packages of Nova Scotia Power are out of control. 23% pay increase for the CEO, and yet Nova Scotia Power shows up at the UARB to ask Nova Scotia to hand over more money and pay higher taxes, higher rates. There is a structural problem, Madam Speaker, inside of Nova Scotia Power. If they can afford to spend money on million-dollar salaries and executive parties and yet still tell Nova Scotians that their power rates are going to go up. My question again to the Premier. When will the Premier order a performance value audit on Nova Scotia Power?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, I agree with this much that the member from Cape Breton South said that when we were on that side, we were a better opposition than they were. The same way we're a better government than they were, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I will read for the member of Cape Breton South from the document that I have already tabled, and it says the costs of such reviews ordered by the board must ultimately be recovered from the ratepayers. Accordingly, the board is very conscious that it should only order such reviews or audits when absolutely necessary for the protection of ratepayers. And Madam Speaker, this is after they went through the long list of audits and reviews that have already been done very recently, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South on his final supplementary.
What I can tell you, Madam Speaker, is the Nova Scotians are not impressed by the continuous bragging of the Premier over there, that he's in government over there, and because he's in government, everything is going to be done the way he and his crowd over there want it. Well, Nova Scotians will have a very different opinion of that during the next election. I can guarantee you that. My final supplementary. Madam Speaker, I think the Premier would be hard-pressed to find many people who enjoyed a 23% increase in their pay last year, including some public servants that he's now dealing with. In fact, most Nova Scotians are finding it harder to make ends meet, many thanks to the combination of NDP tax hikes and an NDP Premier that refuses to stand up for Nova Scotians. Yet he stands up for Nova Scotia Power. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier explain to Nova Scotians why is it okay for Nova Scotians to choose between buying groceries and paying their power bill while these power executives are enjoying double-digit pay increases on their million-dollar earnings? Mr. Premier, I'm asking you, Mr. Premier, Madam Speaker, my question to the Premier. I'm asking the Premier to
the honourable member for Cape Breton. Order. I just want your opportunity to speak. I will have to recognize you. I called order. You didn't stop talking. I recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm asking the Premier to order the salary increases, roll back the salary increases in Nova Scotia Power executives, roll back, and also that any further increases to Nova Scotia from the ratepayers of Nova Scotia to Nova Scotia Power be cancelled until Nova Scotia Power conducts an audit, or this government conducts an audit of Nova Scotia Power executives and finances.
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, as I just pointed out, audits are done regularly, including reviews of all the rate filings that go before the Utility and Review Board. Unfortunately, the members opposite, the members of that caucus, voted against taking the HST off of home electricity. If they had their way, Madam Speaker, power rates would be 8% higher than they are today.
I now recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, last night on a CTV news panel, the Minister of Energy will not commit to stopping any more rate increases. In opposition, the Premier said, no more power rate increases until Nova Scotia Power Inc. and the government help families save at least 15% on their power bills. And I'll table that, Madam Speaker. However, that hasn't happened. Typical of this Premier to say one thing in opposition, but do completely opposite while in power. My question to the Premier, will he commit to keeping the House open and finding a solution to rising power costs, including the formula on determining the shareholders' return on equity, or will he apologise to over 22,000 people who signed a petition and expect more from this Premier?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, the 22,000 people who signed that petition are 22,000 people who got the HST removed from their electricity bills, which they voted against, Madam Speaker. The simple fact of the matter is both parties opposite left behind a privatized utility dependent on fossil fuels, on the international fossil fuel market that has driven up the cost of power in our province. This government is making the switch over to renewables, is signing agreements that will mean there will be stable, long-term rates that will benefit all of the citizens of our province.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
At a time when people in Nova Scotia are looking for bold leadership to help bring this province out of recession, the NDP government is grasping at straws to distract from the real issues facing families, like skyrocketing power rates and protecting patients' health care. In opposition, the now Deputy Premier, when talking about the UARB's role in power rate increases, said the UARB must consider the consumer's ability to pay. My question to the Premier is, why will the NDP not commit to keeping the House open and putting forward solutions that will cause the UARB to consider consumers' ability to pay for the power rate increases?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, as you know, the system that we have before the Utility and Review Board is one where you have a private company created by the Conservatives back in the early 1990s that are tied to the international fossil fuel market, in particular the coal market. The price of coal in the last 7 years has gone up 75%. That is what is driving the costs of power up. This government brought forward an electricity plan that sets out how we get off of that roller coaster, should be a roller coaster, really, a roller coaster that meant that power rates continue to climb. The conversion from coal over to renewables is the only way to resolve the problem over the long term.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In 2009, just days before the election, the Premier said, "This is the wrong time to impose a rate surcharge. The bottom line here is affordability." Clearly, the Premier's bottom line changed as soon as he was elected. We've brought forward suggestions and are prepared to stay in the House to come up with a tangible solution, but clearly the Premier's not. My question to the Premier is, why won't he commit to making good on his promises when in opposition and bring forward legislation to deal with the skyrocketing cost of electricity instead of jet-setting on mile-high adventures with the following the wishes of Amira?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, we are the government that brought in a new electricity plan, one that has been widely praised outside of the industry by independent power producers. Madam Speaker, it is this government that took the HST off of home electricity. It is this government that makes sure that there is an independent efficiency conservation corporation in the province that has saved ratepayers $100 million, Madam Speaker. This is a government that takes the protection of its ratepayers seriously.
Recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, for many Nova Scotians, power bills are increasing, and consequently they now make up a larger percentage of total monthly household expenses. It stands to reason that the same can be said for our hospitals. According to the most recent audited financial statements for Capital District, our province's largest, the line item plant maintenance and utilities had the largest dollar increase of all expenses from 2010 to 2011, over a $5 million increase. This, Mr. Speaker, was a larger dollar increase than salaries and a larger dollar increase than drugs. My question to the Premier, any idea what percentage of the plant maintenance and utilities line item is made up of electricity costs?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, the reason why we have a Utility and Review Board is to carry out the examination of the rate filing. On the question of policy for energy in this province, it is up to the government to set out an electricity plan, which we have done, one that will mean $1.5 billion worth of investment in Nova Scotia in renewable energy. It is this government that has signed a memorandum of understanding with Newfoundland and Labrador for the Lower Churchill project that will help bring rate stability, energy security to the people of this province and indeed more broadly to the people of the region.
I now recognize the Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is one time the Premier should have counted on his health minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, electricity costs make up 16% of the plant maintenance and utilities line item, the largest single expense found in this category. In fact, the plant maintenance and utilities line item now consumes 7% of the overall district budget. In the annual report before that, 6%, and in the report before that, 4%. This fiscal year, the Minister has asked Capital District to cut from their budgets. On top of that, there are wage increases, drug costs, and electricity costs to absorb beyond what the district have built into their plan. And if all of this wasn't bad enough, electricity costs are increasing, not decreasing. Given that electricity costs are unavoidable in health care, Capital District had to find $14 million in mitigations to balance the budget and now have to deal with anticipated wage increases. How will patient care not suffer?
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions has elapsed. I now recognize the Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. During questioning, when the member for Victoria Lakes was answering questions, the Deputy Premier did say a few words there. Not that I'm going to repeat them, but if you would mind maybe retracting them and we'll move on. But he did, well, do you want me to say them? He said the member for Victoria Lakes had an empty head. And I think that was inappropriate in this House. And I thought maybe he should require an apology.
Recognize the Honourable. I'll take that under advisement. I did not hear the comments, and we'll report later. I recognize the Honourable Member for Halifax, Citadel, Sable Island.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, with your indulgence, I would like to introduce a group of distinguished constituents in the East Gallery. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, in the East Gallery today, I have Ms. Susan Lidstone's grade 4-5 class from English Street Elementary, and they are accompanied by parents Brock Caldwell, Sandra Alfoti, and David Ross. Madam Speaker, it's a real thrill to have English Street in my constituency. It's a very environmentally conscious school, and I know students here have won awards to the Resource Recovery Board. And last weekend, I saw them planting a community garden outside. It's a real delight to have them here. I'd like to receive the warm welcome to the House.
We welcome all of our guests in the gallery today and hope you enjoyed today's proceedings. I now recognize the Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to table answers to questions that were asked of me during estimates. A number of the questions that were asked were more directly related to advanced education. However, my staff is pleased to provide these answers and table these at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Government business. Now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we should now leave the chair in the House itself and the whole House on bills.
Motion's carried.